and welcome to our March Hot Off the Press meeting. I hope that the next time we meet, it won't be under these circumstances. This whole nightmare will be over and we'll all be back in the library together. Please remember, Brian continues to serve the public. Instead of checking out books, check out our virtual library at bryantlibrary.org and take advantage of the entertaining and educational resources that we have. Today we're together by the magic of Zoom, which is a virtual conferencing platform which I think we're all appreciating during these times and are all becoming familiar with. We plan to talk about Dear Edward in the library and have a visit with Ann Napolitano, who was supposed to join us there. Sadly, of course, we can't do that, but Ann Napolitano will join us today on Zoom at 1:30. So think about questions for her, and we'll be excited to see her. Okay, so now, let me get back to our business here. Next month, April 28th at 1 o'clock, I did print out a poster.
I have the book.
Maybe you could take a picture of it, but I don't think that's possible. So I'm going to give you about this 2 months, and I will send you an email after the meeting so you can get a record of it. Okay, so on April 28th at 1 o'clock, we're going to discuss in Book Talk with Linda. Linda will be discussing Disappearing Earth. There is a chance that we will be meeting again in this format virtually.
I'm sure we will.
I hope not. Linda, do you have anything you want to mention about the book?
Just quickly, this book, Disappearing Earth, was one of 5 book finalists for the National Book Award last year. It's been on all the top 10 lists, many of them I know, the New York Times. It's set in Russia. We got to deal with Russian names. You all know what that's like. It takes a lot of patience, but it takes place in a Russian peninsula province, and it begins with the abduction of 2 young girls, 2 sisters. One would normally think that what would follow is a very intricate solicitation and pursuit of clues to discover where they are and what happened, but that's not what happens in this book. It's written very differently. It takes place at the end of after the end of the Soviet Union, and the beginning of the Wild West-like corruption of, the post-communist Russia. So there are all kinds of issues that come into play in these intervening chapters. I promise you that the solution will be there. You'll find out what happens, but these stories all shed light on the society of Russia, pretty universal things like racism and violence against women and ethnic tensions and all the things that we see also in our country. It's a beautifully written book. My friend Rhoda said the last chapter took her breath away, as did Seth Meyers recently. So it's worth staying with. It's not easy. It's a little bit of an effort because it's hard to put the pieces together, but you will see that it happens. So I hope you'll all try it. Now the issue is, where can you find it? It's not yet, whoops, I lost myself.
We're watching Arlene.
Oh, okay. Beth will let you know where if it's on Hoopla or what's the other one,
Libby.
Yeah, Libby. So that's the trick right now, is finding it. But hopefully you all will, and I'll see you in a month. And it's wonderful to see your disembodied, beautiful faces. And we really have to celebrate technology and your wonderful librarians for micromanaging this. It's incredible.
Thank you, Linda. Our May book, May 26th, 1 o'clock, is going to be Writers and Lovers by Lily King. Some of you may have read her prior book, Euphoria. She's a wonderful writer. She's also April's Read with Jenna book, Writers and Lovers. April's, Read with Jenna. Jenna is CBS? Jenna Bush, yeah. So that's going to be that is on Hoopla. It's a wonderful book, and you can get it on Hoopla. Hoopla is every book that's on Hoopla is available all the time. So when you find a title that's on Hoopla, there is no restriction. It's always there. You can always download it. So all of you will be able to get Writers and Lovers whenever you choose. Okay. All right, so I think we're going to move on to, we're going to have a short discussion because Ann Napolitano is going to join us at 1:30. So we're going to just spend the next 20 minutes having a discussion among ourselves about the book. We're going to start with, Julie's going to start with an introduction.
Hi again, everybody. Thanks, Beth.
Okay.
So the New York Times review of Dear Edward was written by Angie Kim. She's the author of Miracle Creek, a recent book that was published. She speaks prophetically of a young boy's journey to the far side of disaster. Angie Kim writes, and I quote, "Children read fairy tales to master terror, and perhaps adults do the same with disaster books. More and more, histrionics seem to fill our days with disasters of all types, political, natural, genocidal, technological, populating our social media feeds. While none of the adults in either the real crash or the novel it inspired survive, Napolitano's fearless examination of what took place models a way forward for all of us. She takes care not to sensationalize, presenting even the most harrowing scenes in graceful, understated prose, and gives us a powerful book about living a meaningful life during the most difficult times," end quote. As Ann Napolitano tells us Edward's tragic story, we find ourselves living through tragic times. The rapid spread of a new virus has put a stop to life as we knew it. We are now immersed in quarantine, social distancing, supply shortages, and dramatic, fearful news. Ann Napolitano's timely novel demonstrates through Edward's story the power of hope and the resiliency of the human spirit, a welcome example for us struggling through these difficult days. And we thought the first question that would be appropriate after reading this is, in the face of tragedy or a virus, what does it take to find hope? How does Edward find hope? We're going to go through some discussion now. Like Beth said, we only have until 1:30.
How did everybody?
Somebody's raising their hand.
All right.
Julie and I have been talking about the times in which we're reading this book. We all read the book. Julie and I read the book, I don't know, about 2 months ago when we decided to choose it. And when I read it, I thought it was good. It was well written, it was insightful, but I wasn't as terrified reading it as I thought I would be, because I have a terrible fear of flying. So I thought this was really going to tap into my phobias, but I was okay with it. And then we reread it last week, just a few days ago. I finished it, and I have to say I was fairly terrified when I was reading it this time. And I think so much of that has to do with the times that we're living in now, with this pandemic that nobody ever anticipated would ever happen to us. Did we ever think that we would be in our homes and have short supplies and not be able to hug our families? So I think that played a lot into my mindset when I was reading the book, and the fear that I'm feeling in my everyday life was coming out in my reading of the plane crash. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Oh.
I've lost everybody again. Arlene Katz, we have your screen on. Okay, we're back. Everybody, please make sure your microphone is turned off unless you're ready to speak. Okay? Does anybody have any thoughts about Edward's journey and our journey?
I don't see any hands raised, but if you want to say something, it might be, I'm not sure how easy it will be for me to see the hands with the people, how many people we have. So if you want to say something, feel free to unmute your mic and tell us who you are before you start talking, just so we know where it's coming from.
Mina? Can you unmute Mina?
Oh, sure. Okay, there you go. Wait.
We're sorry, we're practicing this format.
Okay, Mina,
Hey,
there you go.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I think his journey was much more difficult than ours because he had to take it alone.
Mm-hmm.
Not only was he young, but he lost his family. He lost everything, even where he was living, well, the type of life that he had. And he was all alone in this experience.
Right.
So I think that he was much worse off than we are, because although we're in isolation, and I'm alone for the last 3 weeks in pure isolation, the whole world has experienced this.
You're right.
And you're making ways of dealing with it, like we were on Zoom, and making accommodations, whereas there was no way that he can make accommodation. It was a real tragedy. He lost everything. So I think it was much more difficult for him than for all of us now.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay, can I just make it, I don't know if you can see me, hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
You and hear you.
Yeah, he was alone and he wasn't alone, but he was so young and so unaware. It took him a while until he realized that his aunt had lost her sister. And it took him a level of maturity until he could realize, Jordan and also his mother, that Lacey had lost her own sister. So, you know, it's a little bit different. He was alone, and he was not alone because he was surrounded by people who were struggling to save him.
Yes. And he was young, and that was a benefit in many ways, but also more of a heartbreak in many ways too. What did you think about the format of the book, the way it went from Edward and his life as he progressed through his pain and what was going on in the plane up above? Did you like that, or did you find that distracting, or how do you think the author put those two scenarios together?
Hi, I'm Michelle Ardillo. I'm watching from Maryland.
Oh, hi, Michelle.
I just finished reading the book on Saturday, and I saw this meeting with Ann published on Twitter, so I joined in. I hope that's okay.
Of course.
But I felt like it spared me immense trauma being spread out over the course of the book. I don't know if anybody read After the Fall.
Yes.
The plane crash happens all at once, and it's terrifying. I didn't know if I would be able to fly again after that. Whereas this one, it was spread out with all the backstories and everything, and I felt like it was paced so much better. I enjoyed that aspect of it.
Anybody else comment on that?
I think it was a good venue to keep your interest, because it kept going back and forth. Okay, it just held my interest much more than one story versus another story.
What did you think about the characters on the plane? Anybody?
Wait, you know, can I add something to your question before, Beth, about the format? Before we move on, I liked it a lot. I thought the author built up a lot of suspense with the plane, you know, with what goes on the plane, hour to hour, minute by minute. And I thought it was like a nice juxtaposition with seeing him, Edward, you know, I don't know what the right word is, but recover or just cope. You know, alternating chapters. I just thought it lent a lot of anticipation and suspense, and I you know, it's not a suspense novel, but just like a subtle suspense with the airplane going back and forth to present day.
And it kind of keeps in focus what Edward is recovering from.
Right.
You know, you don't have that, it happens in the beginning and then you can kind of put it aside while he moves on. You're constantly being brought back to that situation, knowing what's going to happen.
Beth, can I say, I also felt the same way like Julie. I thought that you are moving with the story, like you are really going journey with him,
Right.
or whatever is happening in the plane, and then you see that he's like survivor, and then you see how it happened. So it makes it more interesting when you are going with the past and what is going on in right now with his life. So it makes it more interesting that way.
Right, right. I think you're also more invested in the story of the plane crash by feeling that you know the characters a little bit. Do you think that the characters were well drawn in those small pieces of their time on the plane? Did you feel any affinity toward any of them?
Oh, I see a few hands up. I'm not sure. I see Kathy, I see Linda also, and Judy. So Linda, wait, you want to say something first about that, Linda, and then we'll take the...
If I can just add a little bit to that question, I think there is a continuity. We find out that he is the random person who lives. Each of these people has a life, has a hope. Some of them don't. I mean, poor Crispin, of course, dies on board. But, you know, each of them has a backstory. Each of them has a hope to go on with his or her life. And he randomly is the survivor. And it plays into the later story of getting the letters. I think there is a connection. It may not shed light on the actual story of his recovery and his coming to terms with what happened, but it does give us a balance. And in fact, the letters are absolutely essential to his recovery. So it does shed light on these other lives and how much he has embraced, you know, representing all of them in the end, I think.
All right. I'm unmuting people with their hands up. So Kathy, you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to it. When I started to read the book, I lost my best friend at age 20 in the Eastern Airlines plane crash, and I thought, oh my God, I can't read this. But it was easier to read than I thought it would be, because you do...
Whose dog is
because they break it up with now and later, you know, future and past. It gives you a little time to like digest the whole thing, and it doesn't hit you terribly. And the power of hope. I'm an existentialist or a fatalist now, because I feel everybody has their number. Because my friend, no matter where she would have been at the time, I think she would have died in that plane crash. But my friends helped me through it. My parents helped me through it, and you do feel very alone. And it's 40 something years ago, and it still hits me today. And I do have a fear of flying. However, I do it because, you know, you have to go on living. But I also feel my grandmother lost her entire family in the Holocaust. I think the power of hope is basically life, and you have a choice to go on, but you do go on because there's nothing else you can do. You're living. Right. And you know, I really think that's Edward. You know, it takes time to go through that, the pain, but I think life itself, you have to live, and people around you do help you. You can't be isolated.
Thank you.
Yes, we are.
Rhoda?
Okay.
I was going to say that the parts on the plane really personalized all of the stories of people. We hear about a plane crash and we see the numbers, and we might see ages, and we might see origins, but we never really learn the stories of the people involved in a major disaster that way. And by personalizing it, I think it made the tragedy a larger thing for each of us to take in. And along with Edward surviving and learning to cope, I kept thinking of all the survivors in the families of those who were lost, and how each of them learned to cope in a different way. And I thought that made the story even bigger and extended it in our hearts to not just Edward and his family, but all of the mother of the soldier and the boyfriend of the girl who was pregnant that he didn't really know. And all of these other stories made the book even more meaningful. So I thought that was a wonderful technique for that alone.
Okay, Judy, you have your hand up? I think, Judy? iPad?
Judy, iPad? No?
No, okay. Maybe it was a mistake.
Okay.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up right now.
Can I ask a question?
Hello?
Of course.
Okay, what do you think was the turning point in Edward's life? What made him come to terms with all this? We saw him isolating himself. We saw him in such great pain. What do you think changed him or made him move on, be able to move on?
You want to talk? Listen to the screen and see if it comes on.
It doesn't.
Oh, hear you.
Who's that?
Isabel, would you like to say something?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean, I think the book really tore my heart apart. I thought it was so sad and so miserable. And going back and forth as are they talking about them on the plane was one feeling. And then the next chapter, you plunge back into Edward's dilemma, and it just hurt over and over again, going back and forth for me.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Kathy has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say the turning point I felt was Shay. Shay, with his relationship with Shay, and when she actually came back to him and wanted to help him with all the letters. He and his father, I think there was a unification there, and I think that changed. He realized that he wasn't alone anymore. You know, the bag of the letters, all the people, I just felt that he didn't feel alone anymore.
Right.
Thank you.
She was honest with him too. She did not just try to make him happy. She was an honest friend. But the letters, he was so determined to read every word of those letters. And this goes back to I think the early question you asked. These other people, what role did they play in his healing, do you think?
I think they played an enormous role. I think it was a catharsis for him, and I think he felt a responsibility because he was alive. So he needed to carry on a piece of their lives in some way.
Right, it gave him a reason to live. I think you're right.
Right.
Rona has her hand up.
I think the hope was community. When he had the letters and he wanted to reach out to them because they reached out to him. And so really going through this alone makes it so much more difficult. And I think that's the parallel for today. Because you see the people working in the hospitals and how awful that is.
Right.
Then when you see them in a group, it takes a little bit of the pressure off each one of them because they're supporting each other. So I think that's really what this teaches us is when you
human connection
and support and connection to help you as an individual get through it because you share a little bit of the burden.
We have Freda's hand up. Freda, did you want to say something?
Freda? Is she not? I don't see her on my page.
All right. I have the virtual hand.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. We can. I don't hear her.
Okay.
So.
Did you agree with John's decision to keep those letters from Edward?
That's a rough one.
Yes.
He meant well. He really wanted to protect his nephew, and initially, I think it would have overwhelmed the poor boy. He couldn't deal with any of it.
He had to face Edward's anger about it.
Yeah. The question, of course, is, and there's no right answer, is when do you share it, or do you share it?
Mm-hmm.
How do you present it?
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a shame that he had to find it covertly.
Yes. Yes.
But I certainly could feel for the uncle and what he was trying to do.
Ultimately, I think he was right. He was only 12 years old and he was still in shock. So I think he made the right decision, but I think it was hard on Edward.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Michelle or Dillo might want to say something.
Yeah, actually, I think John was my favorite character in the book. And I tweeted that to the author. And she said she hadn't heard many people gravitating toward him, but I thought his responses to everything were so measured. And it was like a lot of the adults in Edward's life seemed to say the right thing at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
But when John walked into the garage and saw Edward with the bag of letters and all he said was, "Good morning," my heart just cracked open right there. I just thought it was just the perfect thing. You know, he wasn't angry. He wasn't accusatory. Judgmental. He was just like, "Good morning." And now I see where we are. And so I kind of like that he discovered the letters on his own.
Yeah.
That's just my.
I think Carol also had something to say.
I do. When in the very beginning, they were concerned about him committing suicide. There was a comment later in the book. He wasn't eating. They thought he was going to starve himself to death. It would have been way too overwhelming when he was 11 years old to start receiving all these letters. They needed to have a buffer time before they could move on. And once they knew that he was safe, remember, it was a struggle for him to eat a cracker in the beginning. And the psychiatrist later talked about, we were worried about you committing suicide. And he said, I'd never leave people. I've been left. I would never leave you. But the rest of the family unit was not aware of that going on in his mind.
Right, right. What do you think well, we kind of talked about this before, the turning point for Edward was, I think, the letters. I think we all pretty much agree on that, right? And then there were two things that were said to him during the course of the book that I think sort of made his path easier. One was when he went to see, and Linda and I talked about this earlier. You want to add to it? You want to describe it, Linda?
The tarot reader. Remember he met his brother Jordan's girlfriend, and she had been seeing a tarot reader, and there was something sort of esoteric about what she said to him, and then she said, "You're not that special. You were not." She said it was dumb luck. Nobody chose you for anything. Somehow he felt this enormous responsibility, and when she said, "Nah, it was just random. You just happened to be the one to survive." I mean, it's certainly very existential, as someone mentioned before. It's that the nature of life, who gets the virus and who doesn't sometimes, or who survives the flight. It was just dumb luck. What would that have done to him? Why would that have made him feel differently about this whole experience? I mean, he was so self-conscious. He was so tied up in why me, why me? What do you think this would have done to him? Hearing that from of all people, the tarot card reader.
I hate to interrupt your thought, Linda, because I always appreciate what you have to say, but I noticed that Ann Napolitano is on our Zoom chat right now. So I'd like to welcome you, Ann.
Oh, yay.
We're excited to have you here. We think we sorted through all the technical issues, and we're happy to welcome you today. Let me make sure Ann is not muted. Hold on one moment. Let me just make sure. Okay. Ann?
Oh, I am unmuted. You just unmuted me, didn't you?
Yes. Hey, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
There you are. Hello.
Hi. It's been really nice listening to you guys talk about the book.
Oh. Wait a minute.
Can everybody hear Ann?
Yes.
Oh, somebody's shaking their head. No.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Good. Good.
I really appreciate you guys reading Dear Edward and appearing here at 1 o'clock on a Tuesday. It's so nice of you. And Michelle, that was your tweet. That's so interesting that you like John so much. I did love hearing that because almost no one mentions John. I can tell you guys a little bit about the genesis of the book if you'd like, and then I'm happy to answer questions or listen to you guys talk about it.
That would be great.
Okay. So it started because in 2010, I became obsessed with a story that was in the news. And there was a real plane crash. There was a flight from South Africa bound for London, and it crashed in Libya. And there was only one survivor, and it was a 9-year-old Dutch boy. And they found him about a half-mile away from the rest of the wreckage, and he was still buckled into his airplane seat. And he had a punctured lung and a broken leg, but he was otherwise fine. And everyone else on the flight, including his parents and his brother, had died immediately.
Oh.
And it was huge news at the time. Like, it was 24/7. Everyone knew about it. Most people have forgotten about it at this point because so many terrible things have happened in the interim. But I became obsessed with this story right away. And there was 2 things about it that really interested me, I think. And one was that in 2010, social media had kind of reached the point where it was recognizable as what it is now, where everyone that you knew was on Facebook, including your mother. And prior to that, that had not been the case. So when this crash happened and it was this huge international event, there were young girls around the same age as the Dutch boy that created pages about him on Facebook and talked about how cute he was and how sad they were for him. They didn't know him. This was just them emoting at him. And there were amateur flight aficionados who were speculating about why that flight may have crashed because they didn't know. There was leaks from inside the hospital where the little Dutch boy was that the president of Libya had called him on the phone to see if he was okay. So for the first time in my experience, there was this massive international news story, but it wasn't given to us just by the gatekeepers, just by the journalist. It was being, in a sense, reported on by everyone. And so there was this 360-degree view of this event, which I found really fascinating. And the other aspect of it was, I guess, a more sort of emotional connection, because there was a picture that accompanied almost every news story about this crash. And it was a photograph of the little Dutch boy in his hospital bed. And he was so small and so beautiful and so broken. And I kept looking at that picture and thinking, how in the world is that little boy going to be able to climb out of that hospital bed and walk out of that hospital without his mom and his dad and his brother? How can he walk away from this event and have a life, any kind of a life again on his own? And I have 2 boys, and at the time they were 1 and 3, so they were little idiots. But it was part of it. And so in a way, I was so obsessed with this story that I knew almost immediately that I was going to have to somehow write my way into understanding it. So what I sort of ended up doing, I didn't know if that boy could be okay. I honestly was worried that there was no way he could be okay after surviving something like that. So what I had to do was create a set of fictional circumstances that would lead him to a place where I could believe that he could possibly be okay. And it took me 8 years to write it. And even though it was a really, obviously, a tragic story, it was actually the most joyful writing experience of my life. I think because what I discovered was that the only way that he could be okay would be if he was surrounded by an inordinate amount of normal human kindness. So the people in his life, flawed as they are, all step forward to help him, which is part of us as humans. And when terrible things happen, I mean, we're in one of these terrible things right now, people step forward and want to help. So living in that world for 8 years actually ended up being a really wonderful gift for me. And I was truly sad when it was over. I would have gone on writing this book for a couple more years, but that would have been totally stupid. So that's the genesis of the story. And I'm happy to answer any specific questions or speculations.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on hands raised on the side here. If anybody wants to say anything, or if you know how to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to just go ahead, because it's hard to see the hands raised all at once.
Michelle has her hand raised.
Oh. Hi, Ann. I have a question about the writing process. Did you write the plane crash separately, or did you write Edward's story with the backstories flowing in and out? How actually did you do that?
I wrote it actually the way that it is. I wrote it, I wrote a plane chapter and then an Edward chapter and then a plane chapter and then an Edward chapter. And the way that I tend to write in general, and definitely was true for this book, is that I basically end up rewriting the first 150 pages of a book for like 6 years. And then once that foundation is completely solid, then I can write like sort of the last third of the book. So I don't write a rough draft that goes all the way to the end, because the end feels like so important and delicate, and I need it to work. And so I can't build that top layer of the house until the bottom layers are more secure. And also, when I say I rewrote the first 150 pages, I mostly rewrote the Edward sections. The first year of the 8 years, my husband actually challenged me. The book I wrote before this, which is called A Good Hard Look, that has Flannery O'Connor as a character in it, was very hard for me to write. I said that Dear Edward was a joyful experience. A Good Hard Look was not a joyful experience. It was very, very difficult, very challenging. And my husband watched me go through that, and he suggested that for the next book that I write, that I change something, because that it would be stupid to do the same thing twice. So my real problem was I had always been what is called an intuitive writer, and I still to some extent am, but like, so the best analogy that I know of to describe what that is there's an E.L. Doctorow quote where he says that writing a novel is like driving home on a foggy night. You can only see as far as the end of the headlights, but that's enough to get you home. You can see a little bit and then a little bit and a little bit, but you can get home that way. And that's the way that I had always written. And it's really fun because it's like reading. It's an act of discovery. Like someone will enter the room and say something that I did not know they were going to say. And then something else happens and I'm like, oh my gosh. And then I know that this will happen. And so it's wonderful. But I think as my writing
is anyone frozen or just me?
As my more way, it'd be more frustrating. Hard look, I was often had 4 days like that. The first year of it, I did being fairly straightforward and fun to write. But the Edwards sections, what happens to him after the crash is completely open-ended, obviously. Anything could have happened. So those were the sections that I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote, trying to get right. That was a long answer for your short book. Anyone else want to raise their hand?
I have a question. First, I want to thank you for joining us. We really appreciate seeing you. And I wondered what made you decide to make the plane crash human error rather than mechanical error?
Well, basically, it was really during that first year when I was doing research, a lot of the research had to be about planes and plane crashes because I had no prior aeronautical interest or knowledge at all. I never would have thought I would write a book about a plane crash. So I did a lot of reading. I read a lot of the NTSB reports on all like the major plane crashes that have taken place in the last 15 to 20 years. And I wanted to make sure that the plane crash felt real and authentic and true, so that I didn't want to sensationalize it or make it melodramatic. So I actually ended up, the reasons that my plane crashed are the same reasons that a real plane crashed. Not the one that the Dutch boy was on, but there was an Air France flight in 2009, I believe, from Rio de Janeiro bound for Paris, and it crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. And they didn't find the black box for 3 years, but then when they found the black box, they discovered what had happened. And so it was pilot error in that crash. It was exactly what happened. They flew into a rainstorm that ended up being bigger and colder than they had anticipated. And the pitots on the side of or however you say it, I still don't know, on the side of the plane froze, and it threw them onto manual, and the captain wasn't in the room at the time it happened. So I really, that's why I used another real crash.
And I wonder if that Edward in some way, that it wasn't that it was a right
in the cockpit, like it could have been one of the passengers who lost, when
right.
So whatever happened, it was so outside of Edward's sphere that I think that was why in part he sensed that information couldn't help him. And really that information, knowledge helps certain types of people, and it helps John, like his uncle. So I think some people it allows them to have an explanation that makes sense, but for others it just doesn't help emotionally, that is.
Right.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm Margie, and I was wondering if you have had any contact with the Dutch boy and whether he knows that your book exists and that he was the impetus for it.
I have had no contact with the Dutch boy. His guardian and aunt recently reached out to me because she had heard about the book and she's reading it. There's nothing in the book that has anything to do with the Dutch boy or the Dutch boy's life. The Dutch boy was adopted by his aunt and uncle, and they brought him back from the very first minute of protecting his privacy. They blacked out the windows of their station wagon. There were no pictures. There was no press ever. Which is what you should do in that situation. So they were exemplary. So I never knew anything after the crash of what, how he was or what happened to him, and I didn't want to. That situation is the inspiration for the book, but it's really not based on his story. And if I had my druthers, I wish that I had just made the whole thing up, because I hate the idea that even slightly this could disrupt this young man's life, because he's already been through so much. But alas, I became obsessed with an actual news story, which is very common as a news story or historical piece of information or some truth leading to fiction is the source of many, many, many novels. But I hope that it doesn't cause them disrest.
Linda?
I just have another writer question. You seem to know instinctively, and your intuition guided you, that you were not just going to tell the story of his recovery. What told you initially that it was going to be right to juxtapose the two stories? Because everyone seems to agree that it made the story richer and more approachable, and the pacing was excellent. What told you that this needed to be told in two separate ways?
There were only a few things that I knew when I first started, and one of them was that I wanted the two storylines to sit side by side. And I just knew that they had to have equal weight, and I knew that they needed to alternate. And I think the reason for that was because I felt like if something that extraordinarily catastrophic happened to you, you would be carrying that weight with you for the rest of your life. And it wouldn't be a matter of setting it down. It would be a matter of learning to bear that weight and to have it become just part of you. So I think for Edward, when the book came out and people started referring to the flashback chapters, I was initially confused because I actually don't think of them as flashback chapters. I think of the two storylines existing in the present tense side by side. And I think that's how it is for Edward. Like, that day shaped him and shaped everything for him. And so it lives on inside him. And it lives on. Like, he comes to believe, obviously, that the plane is still in the sky. So and also in a way, it also was just saying, like, the people on this plane matter as much as the people on the ground. Like, there's nothing, just because they die doesn't mean that their lives are less interesting or silly or wonderful than this boy who happened to be able to walk away from it.
I have a comment. I found that the fact that very poignant. And when Edward shows up, they don't have children, and now they get this teenager who comes to live with them, and they have to deal with that. What gave you the idea to do that? I thought it was very effective.
I don't know. I know actually the real aunt and uncle who adopted the Dutch boy had, I think, 2 children of their own who were his cousins, obviously. Mm-hmm. So he joined a family. I don't know. They just appeared that way. Like, it felt right that they were broken. And also it seemed like I wanted to show in some sense, like, that this boy falling out of the sky, like, no one's prepared for that. Like, no one's life is set up to be like, well, it's easy right now. This is a good time to adopt a 12-year-old who's been through hell. Like, you're in the middle of your life. There are things that are going on. A year from that point, they may have succeeded and had a baby. Like, it's just the moment in which this world explodes is going to be in the middle of the life that you're trying to lead, and that's messy. And it's really messy for Lacey and John and their marriage. So I don't know, it seemed right.
No, I thought it was very effective, very good.
Thank you.
It's Lois Schnipper.
Hi, Lois.
Hi, I just wanted to tell you, Anne, that your book resonated so deeply with me. I lost my daughter 9.5 years ago.
Sorry, just hang on a minute. Julie, I don't see you.
Hi.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
And when I read your book, I realized that I recovered in exactly the same way that Edward did, because it wasn't until I realized that other people were mourning the death of my daughter. It was not just me mourning. And when he read the letters and realized how important these people were, because they were mourning the same way that he was, that you then reach out to these other people who are sharing the same horrible experience, and it heals. It does make you begin to feel better, and the depth of grief begins to lessen, and the wonderful memories that you have become stronger as you're sharing them with these people, and you can then get your life back together in some way. So I thought your way of writing this was brilliant, and I hope that this book is seen more than just a novel, but a way for many other people who are grieving to realize that reaching out and recognizing others are grieving with you is so important.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm so sorry about your daughter. I mean, I've been getting a lot of really wonderful, heartbreaking emails from readers who have had, you know, some kind of terrible loss and find that Edward's path resonates with them. And that's, you know, I'm very moved by that and gratified that that seems to be the case.
Okay, Julie is manning the hand raises, and I can't find Julie.
So she's frozen. Her screen is frozen.
Her screen is frozen?
It says that on the chat.
Yeah.
Yes, she's trying to talk, but she seems to be muted.
There's no hand raised at the moment. I don't see anybody.
I don't see any hands up.
No.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. Kathy had a hand raised, but you already spoke then, I think, right?
Kathy?
Yeah, I think she might have already made her comment.
Muted. She's muted, Julie.
Yeah,
there we go.
I didn't go yet. I wanted to ask the author, Dad, she makes Dad this mathematician, which is a lineal thinker, and Mom is this freelance writer. And what legacy did, or maybe she didn't even think of this, did she want to live on with Edward from his parents that he lost? Because we know what the brother played in all of this, but.
Well, I mean, I think that Edward becomes a math teacher. So I think he works with 12-year-old boy when he grows up.
That's right, okay. So
he becomes a math teacher for 12-year-old boys or 12-year-old kids.
Right.
The same he was when the plane crashed. And I don't think of it as being that like clean cut what we get from our parents anyway. Like I guess from his mother it would be love, you know, being seen, you know, sitting in that love and, you know, missing her because she's in first class and, you know, like that. I think that there is most in that family of four is a lot of love.
Yeah.
And I think that leads to a lot of grief, but it also means that he's starting from a place where you can become more because you got built up with this wonderful gift.
Okay, thank you. Great book, great book.
Thank you.
I think Victoria might want to say something. I'm going to unmute. Victoria, do you know how to unmute yourself? I'm clicking. Oh, there you are?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Hi, Anne. And it was a great book, and I think we all overall enjoyed it. But as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, what a difficult topic to write, because most people, you know, I think 90% of the population already has a fear of flying. So even to open up the book and to start reading it, I never actually had a fear of flying. And then reading this actually it kind of softened it. The way you wrote it was the style was very soft. So it brought us into, the characters and realizing this, but just knowing their fate was always hard because you had that in the back of your mind and you always knew what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. But it was written very well, and I liked going back and forth in the progression just to see you were moving from minute to minute. You kind of got tighter and tighter at the end when it moved closer and closer to the crash. But I just as a general fact, I was looking up different plane crashes, and they said since 1970 there have been 15 crashes that have had sole survivors. Mm-hmm. And of those sole survivors, 12 of them were children. No rhyme or reason to it, but I was just even surprised that there were that many crashes, that there were just sole survivors too. So this is, now I'm wondering, as almost beyond this book, of all these survivors, how have they made it, how they managed throughout this whole crash, and their whole, their personal experiences. And since 1970, so most of them were children, and they said somewhere between 10 and 12 years old. So they're how old now, probably in their late 30s or so, or older. But that might be an interesting follow-up too for somebody who's just interested in that, to move ahead beyond that, to see what happened to these children, of all these crashes. But that's not for me to write. But anyway, I definitely enjoyed your book very much, and thanks for being here too for our book talk.
Oh, my pleasure. Actually, there is a documentary. It was on CNN a few years ago. But I think it's streamable now, and it's called Soul Survivor. And one of those soul survivors, a man who's like in his 50s, he went around the world and interviewed, I think, about 7 other soul survivors of plane crashes, of which a couple of them were under the age of 20. Not including the Danish boy, because that hadn't happened yet. It was sort of around the same time. So there is a film, which I watched avidly, obviously, but it came out kind of like 5 years into my writing the book, where he asks them how they are okay. And several of them had led very small lives after the crash, like very fearful, didn't like to leave the house too much. And then some of them lived very sort of adrenaline-filled existences, like racing motorcycles or things like that, because they basically felt like they'd already been through the worst possible thing and they couldn't die. So the documentary is really interesting because you see the sort of different ways that different people respond to something so traumatic.
Interesting.
Anyone else have a question? Or a comment?
Oh, Michelle. Oh, I think she's muted. She's talking now.
I was wondering what's next.
Oh. Well, I just finished. I just finished the year of taking notes and thinking and researching. So I'm about to start writing. This pandemic, being home with my children, has thrown a slight wrench into everything, of course, for all of us. I don't know how to talk about it yet, but I'm about to start it. And
are we 8 years away from reading it?
Yeah, of course you are.
Okay.
I'm hoping that I'll be faster this time than I have been in the past, but like A Good Hard Look took 7 years and Dear Edward took 8 years. So I feel like 4 would be amazing. So I'm kind of hoping for like 4, but I think I'm just very slow. I'm not like a slow writer, but the thing that getting Edward to the place where his emotional recovery and trajectory felt true is like, it's all these tiny adjustments that takes just takes so long, you know, for me to like really feel like I hit the place where it's emotional truth. Unfortunately, I can't write emotional truth on the first go. I can get in the neighborhood of it, and then it's like trying to knit something with many threads. So in order for it to be good enough that I consider it to be the best it can be, inevitably takes, I'm just not fast. I've never been like, you know, some people are like quick thinkers and quick everything, and I'm not. I think I have like emotional intelligence, but it's, and that's where like my skill set and interests lie, but that requires like just very slow burrowing into a story so that it is the truth that I want it to be.
Oh.
So we'll see how long it'll take me.
Rhoda Hellman.
Rhoda.
Yeah. Nobody's commented yet about the ending. I thought the image of the memorial with the birds in the shape of a plane was absolutely beautiful and a stunning touch and a very positive kind of a thing. So I enjoyed that so much. I loved the entire book, but I thought that was a beautiful ending to the story.
Oh, thank you. That actually is a good example of why having an editor is good, because when I sold Dear Edward to publishers, it was good. A lot of people wanted it. Like, it was sought after. It was, you know, like, I was proud of it. And then I started working with my editor at Dial Press at Random House, and that scene where he and Shay go to the memorial was in the book. Like, it was in the final section. It was part of like the interspersed chapters that lead up to the end. And the book actually ended with Edward being found in the wreckage and saying, I'm here, I'm here. Like, the last lines were, I'm here, I'm here. And it was my editor's idea to move that to the end of the book and make it an epilogue. And I think that was so smart and so emotionally correct. But I wouldn't have gotten there on my own. So I'm so grateful to her for having that idea. So thank you. I can't really take credit for it being the ending. I mean, I wrote it, but
you wrote it.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the Shay character? She was such an interesting girl.
Yeah, I love Shay. She kind of, so there were like 3 things that I knew when I started writing. And so one was that I was going to write the Plain and Edward's chapters side by side. And then one of the other things that I knew was that I knew he was going to get adopted by his aunt and uncle. And then I knew that there was a girl his age who lived next door and that he was going to end up sleeping on her floor. But I did not know why or how that was going to happen. So when she showed up at his aunt and uncle's house with her mother and coffee, like one of the first mornings that he's there, it was like Shay just arrived as herself. So like, she just showed up and started talking, and I was like, oh, look at her, like, she's got spunk. And I think she was also so necessary to Edward and the story, because she spoke honestly. She wasn't walking on eggshells like all the grown-ups around Edward. She's easily bored, so she wasn't going to sort of like cater to him in the way that a lot of people were. And also for him in those first days, I think he missed his brother so much. And they were so close that he actually needed to be physically by another child. I think he had to sleep on her floor because he wouldn't be able to survive without the presence of another child, because he needed his brother. So she provides him with that in the beginning as well. And he's a wonderful addition to her life too, because she was bored and she was lonely, and she's kind of weird and unusual. So him being in this unusual, weird situation kind of matched with where she lived from to begin with. So they provide this wonderful care and attention to each other that each of them needs. I really love Shay. I miss her.
Wow.
I mean, I miss all of them, actually.
Was there ever any talk about turning this into a movie?
Oh, Well, actually, it was just optioned. So who knows what will happen, but option is the first step. It was just optioned. This isn't even public yet, but to be made into a TV show. So we'll see if that happens.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question?
I just wanted to comment on you're talking about the emotional truth. I think there was such emotional truth to the character of Edward. It just seemed so true to me the way you described his journey through this pain, just the way an adolescent would act, would feel. Just the need for him to have Shay, to be sleeping on her floor, to not be able to move into that other house. I just really admired it. It's a wonderful book.
So thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was a pleasure to write.
Any other questions?
Oh, Rhoda. Okay, let me unmute you. Hold on. Okay.
Just a comment about the strength of all the characters. I love the principal in his casual way of inviting Edward into this special relationship with him through the plants. I thought that was beautifully done. He never pushed, but he knew that he was offering him so much. And of course, the payback at the end was very interesting. I wasn't expecting Edward to do all of these wonderful things with the money. That was a very inspired idea, too. I really enjoyed so many things about the book, but I thought your characterizations of all the characters was outstanding.
Thank you very much. What to do with the money was really hard. That was a struggle for me for a long time. I knew that he got the money from Jack's, but I had it was just annoying to me because could not figure out how that made sense. He didn't need money. Like, how was I going to make that work? And I didn't figure that out until like 7.5 years in. I did lots of wrong things with it before then. It was tricky.
Anyone else? I'll just scroll down on the side to see if anybody's hands are up.
Okay. Can I speak?
Carol?
Yeah. I want to tell you, reading the book, I love the book, and I like the trajectory of how Edward emotionally healed. But my heart broke for Lacey over and over again. She lost her sister, she had lost babies, and she felt I felt she was sidelined. And yes, the focus is Edward, and he never even truly reached out to his aunt, even when he started to recognize, wait a minute, she lost her sister. So, and I know you can't do everything in a novel, but she just kind of broke my heart along the way and as I was reading the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. I think that, I think Lacey was significantly broken in the moment that he arrived, and then she lost her sister. And I don't think she was as able to articulate and understand her feelings as actually even her husband was, even though John perhaps couldn't articulate them. He was following them and doing things to try to make things better. And Lacey, I think, kind of froze up and got angry and then tried to fix things and then tried to like get a job to make her life move forward. Like, I don't think she knew how to listen to herself in a way that let her show up for Edward in a way that he could open up to her. Although Edward certainly loved her. And I think that moment that they had, even that moment they have in the kitchen, where she comes home kind of tipsy from a celebration at the hospital. And she says some wonderful things to him in that scene, and he receives them, but they can't really connect because Lacey's not built for that in a way. John can reach her, and eventually he does. But I think it's just the way that she, the way that she was. And I think by the end of the book, she's as, put back together as she can be. And that's always not going to be 100% present. But I think that John and Edward accommodate her. I think she's a difficult woman, and there are difficult women. We know them. We are them.
Yeah. Anybody? Anyone?
I don't see any other hands on the digital screen here.
Well, it's so nice of you guys to have me, and it's nice to talk to you about the book, and thank you so much for reading it and coming today virtually.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was definitely the highlight of the month. So,
Yeah.
not the year.
Yeah, and thank you so much. This is Victor. I'm the director of the library, and we just appreciate so much that you came online to do this Zoom book talk with us. So, again, much success in the future.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, guys.
Congratulations.
Thank
Wonderful book.
you.
Right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're all still here? Beth, should we